A profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words.
Good morning. Once again, together in a very strange way. It's particularly strange when you're giving a talk, talking. When we're talking with a few other people on Zoom, we kind of just fall into conversing, but we aren't conversing at this point. I'm just kind of talking. Am I talking to you or to my computer? So I've been thinking about the basic questions of who we are. Does it matter who you think you are? And what are the repercussions of your who I am? And I was thinking about this, and it dovetails very closely with the verse Corin quoted and spoke about last Sunday from the Book of Serenity that says, continuously creation runs her loom and shuttle, weaving the ancient brocade, incorporating the forms of spring, incorporating what's happening right now. And the Zen master poet, author of the verse, says this is the unique breeze of reality. Now, unique here doesn't mean something exclusive and special, set apart, which is kind of how our unique usually is. Unique here is total inclusion. There's just one reality, one whole unique reality. There aren't two realities. And the poet Zen master says, the unique breeze of reality, do you see? And it's not easy to see reality clearly, because our minds create their own version of reality based on the centrality of me, whatever me is. And then we weave a me and believe it to the hilt and defend it ferociously. And if it's attacked, we cling that much harder to it because we've already invested a lot in this who I think I am. And so I don't want to abandon that. I've spent a lot of years cultivating this who I am. And, so I'm that much more inclined to defend it. The more I've invested, the more I cling to it. So our minds aren't wrong to weave a series of narratives to give us some coherence and meaning. Our weaving is the same activity of creation as in the verse. It's the same activity of life. But what are the strands we weave? Spring and birdsong, or my gripes about myself and you and life and the political world? Right? How are we weaving, and out of what, and to what end? So our minds, our delicious, benighted minds, believing as they do the story we weave, misconstrue the reality we live in and distort it hugely. So our minds mistake what and who we are. And the consequences are disastrous. All that anxiety about the future, anxiety about each other, and our fear of death, our fear of financial or emotional insecurity, all our resentment when things don't go the way we think they should. We don't generally see how all that suffering is a direct result of our made-up stories about who and what we are. We think that we get anxious because we need to protect this story of who we are, this me, who I am. And it's really, that's one of our upside down views. There was an early translation of the Heart Sutra that we used in Minnesota, said we have upside down views. I liked that. Now, I is such a convenient word that's extremely useful. Even Shakyamuni used it. It's not the word or even that it refers to something, but it's a huge mistake. It's really a tragedy to conflate I and the self. I or me, isolated and opposed to others, is our biggest delusion. We think of it as our most precious possession almost, but it's our biggest delusion. And so when we groom this me, as we do so much, we're grooming our biggest delusion and we're enriching our delusion. So then turning a spotlight on me makes us aware of our fragility. But then we can only address it, that vulnerability, in terms of me. And so we keep this cycle going where we keep reinforcing our fragility and our vulnerability and our fears and our anxiety as we reinforce this me. And so then we double down on being even more protective and defensive of me. And that kind of focus is the upside down view that has the opposite effect from what's intended. And this is all a self-referential dead end with terrible repercussions for all of us. In each of us, this me building agenda, and it has consequences for me and for everyone and everything I encounter. So a different way to explore who you are is to open the range of inquiry. What kind of self am I? And what are the consequences of my view of me? The Dharma is not a dogma. It is a way of being invited to ask different questions from the ones we've traditionally been asking ourselves about who I am. The Dharma says, consider this. You are not a thing. After all, you're a collection of patterns. And if this seems risky and anti-intuitive even, that's just how much we've bought into the story of our solidity, with all the dangers that come from that view. The danger of falling apart, the fear of the other, the belief in the supremacy of me. All of these arise from our foolish view of who we are. And reality is far, far better. Reality is we are the creative weaving of events and experiences, forming an ever-changing brocade. That ancient brocade is today's brocade, weaving today and spring and you and me. So life is never static. Our view of our solid self tends to be static. That's why we get so surprised when we look in the mirror and see more wrinkles or more gray hair or all of that. Life is always on the move. It's not only changing, it is change itself. The Dharma says change, or call it impermanence, isn't a problem, it's a solution. We don't need to live defensively and anxiously. But we have to see ourselves living defensively before we can do much about it. And the Dharma assures us that, and our Sangha assures us, and our teachings together, and us together, assures us that we can afford to take the story apart, the story we've been living by, and that it won't erode your being to do that. It will help you blossom. It will help you be true and at ease. One of the wonderful things about that imagery of the ancient brocade and about creation constantly weaving the brocade of reality is that it expresses how endless movement and change are also endless interconnection. The weaving activity creates an endlessly evolving brocade. I often speak of the twin principles of impermanence and interdependence, but they aren't separate principles. The intricate, constantly evolving patterns that are each of us are all interwoven patterns in a large pattern called life, and a larger pattern called the universe of interdependent arising. It's all one activity. Viewed from one side, we see change, movement, and movement. Viewed from the other side, we see the interweaving. They're the same activity. Constantly woven or evolving patterns are impermanent by nature. And so if we are a brocade of patterns, then we are impermanent by nature. Change isn't something outside us, acting on us, often against our will, which is how we often see it. So how do we envision ourselves as change? Well, learning is change, maturing, creating, taking in a new experience. These are some of the faces of change. Loss in all its forms is another face of change, the one we most dread. So acceptance of impermanence means acceptance of loss and death. And that we call radical because it seems so alien to us, although it's natural and happening all the time. The becoming and passing away is momentary. This is what we are, arising and passing away moment by moment by moment. It's really natural and true. And so it's hard to make sense of that because we have built a story that is so different. But as this sort of hard to grok truth of what we are as change and impermanence, as that is digested, fear begins to lose its hold on us. So we fear to let go of our idea of our safety and needing to fend off death. But in the letting go of that, we wind up letting go of that fear. It loses its hold on us. We can still comes up, but it doesn't have that same grip on us. So what is this tapestry of life made of? If it's not my cockamamie ideas about it. And one of my favorite Thich Nhat Hanh expressions, for which I will always be grateful to him, is the self is made of non-self elements. It's just such a nice phrase. Rolls right off the tongue. The self is made of everything that's not self, not just a few odds and ends, everything that's not self. So the self that's made of non-self elements is made of all experience, all relationships, all responses and actions, all thoughts too, And not just a lifetime of human relationships, but all relationships with all beings, including so many that I know nothing about, yet are part of, not just impacting my life, they are part of my life. So the Dharma is a very hopeful and positive understanding of life. And when I first moved to Sonoma County, I didn't know how to say it this way. And the first couple of months after I moved here, I was invited to some kind of a summer cookout party, potluck. And the people I'd met said, "Oh, come and you'll meet Sonoma County," because they were people who knew a lot of people. And of course, I didn't know many people, so I was happy to sit quietly on a bench for part of this time and just take in the scene. I'm not that good at meeting new people. And at one point, I'm sitting quietly on the bench, and two women marched up to me very purposefully. I'd never met them before, and said, "What I don't like about Buddhism is that it's so negative. It's all about death." And I was floored, really. I didn't know how to say, this is a very hopeful, very positive teaching, the Dharma. It's about taking full part in life, which includes death. So the Dharma is a very hopeful and positive understanding of life. Reality is vast and coherent, though it isn't living on our terms, and so it tends to look incoherent. And we are integral threads in this ever-weaving tapestry of life. And the Dharma points out that we suffer dukkha. Dukkha is anxiety, it's depression, it's fear, because we misunderstand life and misunderstand ourselves. And so the Dharma says to live naturally, in accord with reality, is to be peaceful and naturally loving. Very positive message. So, how do we proceed? And there are many teachings that address, in the Dharma and outside and beyond the Dharma, that address living with the flow of life versus going against the grain. And Dogen's central teaching, the Genjo Koan, is a key one of these teachings. He says, very famously, conveying the self to the myriad beings to authenticate them is delusion. The myriad beings advancing and authenticating the self is enlightenment. 2 lines, I'm going to say them again. Conveying the self to the myriad beings to authenticate them is delusion. The myriad beings advancing to authenticate the self is enlightenment. So he's talking about how we connect to the world beyond our skin. And what does he mean by conveying ourselves? It's imposing ourselves on the world. We've been studying privilege lately in this Sangha, seeing how the white majority, and each of us in our own ways, has imposed itself on less fortunate groups, minority groups and foreigners in this particular case that we've been studying. So we're learning how heavy our footprint has been and still is, how full it is of assumptions with us at the center and as the standard. And this attitude runs through our lives. It's not only about race and class. It runs through everyone's life, in all our thoughts and actions. So it isn't just a political issue, it's a core human issue. We humans do this, imposing ourselves, conveying ourselves into the world and onto the world. We do this all the time with everyone we meet. We do this with every thought. We turn subjects into objects. And we impose our beliefs moment by moment. So this often painful exploration of my privilege in the world, and I'm seeing it, my privilege in the world, seeing how painful and oppressive it is useful on its own terms about privilege, social privilege, and class privilege. But it is also a window into what we are, all of us, doing all the time from the position of me. And this is what Dogen is pointing to when he says we convey ourselves to the myriad beings and think we're authenticating them with our regard, our attention. So for conveying, use imposing or giving your seal of approval or validating. I validate this. Who am I to validate something? You know, we name the animals and plants and we think these are their true names, but the otter and the redwood don't call themselves otter and redwood. And if you're part of the majority, people don't ask where you came from. But if you look or sound different, the assumptions and labels come fast and furious, different from me. And in the case where me is part of what I see as a majority and have taken as a standard, well, there I'm already imposing myself. So the innocent seeming urge we may have to ask someone where they come from because they look different from us, and maybe we think we have an idea where they come from and we're curious about it, that's anything but innocent. To that person, we're being cast as an outsider. And they're being called on to give personal details to a stranger. So we need to keep paying attention to all the ways in which we can possibly see ourselves imposing ourselves on others, on life, on our poor suffering planet. Conveying the self to the myriad beings to authenticate them is delusion. And we mostly aren't aware of how we impose on the world and how we assume that our regard and opinions authenticate other people or other beings. We automatically privilege ourselves over others, and we privilege humans over other life forms. Automatic isn't real, it's never really automatic. It's quick as an eye blink, quick as a thought running through our minds. It's not truly automatic because it's not truly natural. But every time we do this, we're falsifying our relationship with ourselves and all other beings. And we're living in the fog of delusion. We are not the bee's knees. I love that phrase. We are not the bee's knees. I just so like the phrase so much, I looked it up, and originally it meant something small and insignificant in case a bee actually has knees. But by the early 20th century, it had turned into something wonderful, something very special, the bee's knees. So Dogen having named this delusion of imposing ourselves on the world, he shows us a model of authentic action, authentic relationship. He says, the myriad beings, and that includes us, the myriad beings advancing to authenticate the self is enlightenment. So to convey is an assertive verb, it's a transitive verb. I do it to you. I do it to you. There's lots of subjects and objects in this. To advance doesn't have a direct object. It's an activity. To advance is to move forward without imposing. without imposing oneself on other beings. We are who we are because of everything else. So we are allowed to exist and supported by myriad other lives. To advance is what all beings are doing as we buzz and throb our way through our days and nights, when not imposing ourselves, conveying ourselves over others like steamrollers. I was once told that I was a little bit too much like a steamroller. That was some time ago. I've been working on that ever since. At that time, I was the Ino and director of an Ango, of a residential Ango, and my job, I thought, was to, crank up that engine and roll and gather everybody into shape. So it was a very important time to start learning that there's got to be a better way to do this. Myriad beings advancing, and in so doing, authenticating the self, authenticating themselves and others, can only happen when we stop conveying, when we stop rolling on like steamrollers and flattening what's in front of us. And instead, advance means to open ourselves receptively to life. The myriad beings are always advancing, and we are too. But we're so distracted by our stories that we're rarely paying attention to this. We're rarely receptive. Because imposing is it's a lot of hard work, this imposing ourselves on the world. It's a hard work of keeping track and of having the energy for it and doing it and all that. It takes up so much energy. We have very little time left to actually be advancing and living together or paying attention to that. When the myriad beings advance, that's all of us dancing and weaving together. All of us engaging together. And it seems like a tall order to stop imposing ourselves on the world. But in dropping off our me first view, we drop off a great deal of anxiety, anger, resentment, fear. And we drop off a great deal of aggression against each other and our planet. And I say dropping off anxiety and resentment very much because this is what we do in Zazen. Dogen describes Zazen as dropping off views of self and other. Dropping off our focus on me and how well am I doing my Zazen. That's one reason that we don't want to be measuring our Zazen, because that's one more self-grooming activity. Dropping off this belief in being distinct and opposed, and that we come first. And in the dropping off of Zazen, which may be momentary, and then the mind floods back with all its agendas about me, and then we see that and we drop it again. In those times of dropping off, we do feel at ease. We aren't anxious and fearful. That's our true life. And we do this dropping off not only in Zazen, but in all our actions, all our activities that are based on the Bodhisattva vows. Because the Bodhisattva vows are kind of a template for our advancing with all beings in our activities in the world. Dropping off delusion is the root of compassion, because it is participating in the true interwoven world of connection, which is the ground of compassion and empathy. You know, the aim of awakening isn't a self-grooming. It's a not dropping off a self that needs grooming so that we can actually take our place in the world. The aim of awakening is the same as the aim of the Bodhisattva vows. It's the same aim. It's concern for all beings everywhere blossoming, advancing into concern for all beings. So inner transformation is outer transformation. They, again, are not two separate worlds or activities even. All our attentiveness to our actions and their impacts on other beings. And that's an important aspect of compassion, is the awareness of our impacts on other beings, because everything we do has an impact. And all our actions informed by this attentiveness, all of this is advancing together to authenticate ourselves and each other. It is the authenticating. It's not something that comes as a result of that. That advancing together is the act of authenticating ourselves and each other. We usually think of a loom and shuttle as separate material things that work on another substance or material to make something. But if you see it like that, you wind up fighting the loom, the shuttle, and the thread. And decades and decades ago, I wanted to engage a craft, and I had no idea which one. And so I sort of tried out a couple of different crafts. And I started weaving. And I didn't stay with it, partly because I didn't have much interest in fabric, but I loved the total engagement of the whole body and the hands and the feet and the mind and the threads and the warp and the weft. All of that engaged in a very much movement, because weaving is movement. It was a lovely activity. When creation runs her loom and shuttle, that's you and me. That's where we are weaving on a loom, or we are the weaving of the loom. We are the loom, the shuttle, the threads. That's you and me. We are part of the activity of weaving life. And we can weave tangled messes, a weak and loopy fabric, or we can take our true place as part of the weaving of all beings into the brocade of life. The loom, the shuttle, spring, you and me, all are the activities that together are the brocade called life, endlessly weaving. The loom and the shuttle are spring, and we are spring. We are all the activity of advancing, of dancing together. Nothing is left out. So maybe that's my song to springtime. So, thoughts, comments, questions, reflections?
Yes, please.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Jisho. Thank you for the talk. A lot of different parts of it are resonating and moving and shifting in me, but there's just a few things I wanted to pull out. The weaving that you were just talking about, the living fabric, I saw this stark contrast to typesetting. I once, in Sebastopol, there's a place where you actually put the letters in the frame, or whatever it's called, right? And then you make however many hundreds of copies you're gonna make. That's dead. Versus the weaving is alive, it's changing.
Well, you know, when you start set out weaving, you spend an awful lot of time putting the threads, that's the warp, in place. And then what are you doing weaving? You're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Maybe you're changing the thread some. And with typesetting, you're taking these little bits, seemingly separate bits, and you're putting them together into a pattern, a provisional pattern. You crank out all the copies, and then the type gets taken apart, and we remember that it was only a provisional pattern, although we have this little record on the page. So I love words so much, and I love books and paper stuff so much that I've never thought of them as dead.
Okay.
But it can be tedious. It can be tedious. It can be because each part seems to be cut apart from the movement of life. And that, if that's the case, we need a different medium. That's how I felt with weaving partly. I liked moving back and forth, but I didn't want to spend hours and hours going with the shuttle going back and forth to produce a fabric that I was maybe not so interested in. So we have to find that's why we're all different. Find our own ways to express weaving and advancing together.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Can I ask one more thing? Should I wait and see if other people?
If it's connected, if it's something else, we should drop it and come back later. Something else. Okay. Let's see if someone else has. But you know, I'm reminded this typesetting is that Joko, whom you never met, I don't think, Joko Hazelwood, who was the first priest I ordained and gave transmission to, in his much younger years, he'd been part of the San Francisco poet scene that was sort of the end of the beat era. And he realized he was not a poet, so he decided to publish. He bought a typesetting machine because they were going out of style. And he bought this and he worked nights in the post office. So during the day, he could make beautiful hand-set books of the poems of the poets, of his friends whose poems he wanted to get out into the world, and then sold them cheaply. So for him, it was that advancing together, and it was a tremendous weaving together. And it was called the Auerhahn Press, and he had a certain renown in the Bay Area for it. Tomas, sure. Unmute yourself and let me know.
Hi, Jisho. Thank you for the talk. In my interest in Buddhism, obviously, awakening and enlightenment, whatever that is a central theme, and that obviously is opposed to being, at the effect of the ego, and many of the and there seems to be, like, having gone to retreats with Adyashanti and other non-dual teachers, there does seem to be I don't know, somehow a shift that can occur into an awakened state where you're no longer being controlled by your ego.
Mm-hmm.
And there's obviously many practices, and I just was curious of your experience in that path.
There's sometimes, for me and for others, there's this discrete experience that is an enlightenment experience, because it is so different from how we otherwise see life. And that can be very precious, or it can be something that we then carry around and measure everything else by, in which case we've perverted it. There are many ways to experience enlightenment as there are people, I think. So there are small and large experiences. I remember Katagiri Roshi describing that he was up at Tassajara in the early days when Suzuki Roshi was still alive, and they were teaching together. He was up at Tassajara in the summer and had a big enlightenment experience. Now, he didn't talk about this in Minnesota with his students. I heard about it when he led a session in Massachusetts. So it was sort of because we get too crazy about it. Oh, I want one like that, So off in Massachusetts, he felt free to talk about it more. And he said, he had this great big enlightenment experience, and for a week felt sort of exalted. And then he returned to what he called stinky katagiri. And Suzuki, he shared all this with Suzuki Roshi, who actually sent to Japan and got a certificate of enlightenment for him, which he then burned in the stove, in the wood stove. Katagiri burned it. So we don't talk about it so much, or about specific enlightenment experiences in our tradition, because it's such a hot potato. So enlightenment is also a moment by moment thing. One moment we really have dropped off. Enlightenment is, whether it's a specific experience or seems like just a part of your life, it is the dropping off of that ego self, not losing it entirely. Jung said a very interesting thing. He said he thought Zen Buddhism was one of the only times that he'd ever encountered or heard about where the ego gets a back seat. You still have an ego kind of urging you on in some ways, but it's in the back seat. So the ego's not in the front seat, and we're experiencing life together intimately. And then the ego resumes again. It comes back, hops back into the driver's seat. And then we say, oh, couldn't you go back to the back seat? So we're having this conversation back and forth in our zazen, out of our zazen. And sometimes, it's not something we're so aware of. I find myself that sesshin is one of the greatest experiences for that kind of having moment after moment, or repeating moments of dropping off body and mind and being present as it is with all beings. And I guess for the first 20 or 30 years of my practice, enlightenment was something I wanted to go to, but then we've turned it into an object, and an end state, and that perverts it right in itself. So in my later years, I look to Zazen and other experiences informed by Zazen to be times of dropping off my baggage and being present and sharing and engaging in a different way. Being authenticated by life. You got to show up to be able for that to happen. But we all have many different ways of viewing it. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. Will that cover it for today?
Yeah, thank you.
Jisho, thank you for your talk, and I listened to every minute of it. And I'm just wondering, I was intrigued by your idea of not going out and letting things come to you. I forget how you
no, you do. You let things come, rather than imposing yourself on things, you let things advance. And you're advancing too.
Right. And I'm thinking, and then I was thinking about how you were talking about you were being accused of being a steamroller. I've had my steamroller moments, and I'm just wondering, somebody's got to be that person. And I was thinking specifically about all our experiences with ZenFest, and like nobody wanted to be the steamroller. And if nobody is, you wouldn't have the ZenFest. So I'm wondering how, somebody cannot be a steamroller and yet control, put that,
for me, ordaining was the beginning. I've had decades to try to figure out how to lead without being a steamroller. Still working on it, but steamrollering isn't the best way to lead ZenFest either. You have to put a lot of energy into it. Yes, you have to be a motivating force, and yes, you wear yourself out at it, and you have to do things. But when we do it in terms of these are the people are the little objects on the chessboard. I have to move you here and move you there, whether you want it or not. It's not going to be a harmonious Zen fest, right? So
It's going to be a Zen fest.
But there's going to be a Zen fest however we do it. And none of us do it that well when we're the leader. No one can be perfect at that. If you really don't lead, it doesn't really happen, right? So we're very imperfect leaders. And the more you're a leader, the more, it's not the more imperfect you are, but the more it shows, maybe, on yourself and others around you. And so you have to, we learn and we apologize. Over and over. But you see, in that leadership, Rob, I don't think he's not here today. So at some point, I've known Rob since Minnesota, Rob Meyer, now down in San Diego. So he experienced me at Hokyoji, at our country monastery, where I was generally, most often in the later years, the Ino. And some decade or so ago, long after I knew him here, he said, at Hokyoji, he said, we used to call you the little general. And he said, but it was loving. He said, but it was a loving comment. So it was acknowledging that I still was not really good at being a leader yet, but I was doing it with good heart. And so they forgave me for it. So I was the little general. So there we are.
Jisho?
Yeah, hi, Mark.
Hi, I got to apologize for my my running the meal tables at Zen Fest in a timely manner so everybody can sit down to eat.
But that's what we're trying to do. That's a service. Yeah, and we try to do it politely instead of saying, get out of my way, I'm trying to do a good thing. So how do we do a good thing while we're trying to do another good thing? That's tough. That's tough. I agree.
And I wanted to just thank you for using the word grokking the truth. That was very nice. And, the idea about those two women coming up to you and talking about how the Dharma is so negative, being a recovering Catholic and the Christianity way of, being born with original sin. That's why I practice Dharma. I listen to Dharma talks and to Stoicism, just because it is so positive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jisho?
Hi, Barry.
Thank you so much for your talk. Has all kinds of things churning inside me.
Good.
I wasn't sure I was going to speak, but I had to say, when you told me that some people called you the little general, I just have to say something. Because of course my dad was an actual general, a 3-star, and I am the recovering son of a 3-star general. And one of the things I wanted to say, I think, because this came up for me in your talk, is that sometimes it is true for me that seeing and letting go of my small self is a huge relief. However, sometimes that work is incredibly tedious. And I'll just give one example. My wife and I are reading right now Bell Hooks's The Will to Change, which is about basically dismantling toxic masculinity, which is a son of a military officer I have a fair portion of, I will say, much of it unexamined. That's pretty painful sometimes, both to see it in myself and also to see how I have harmed other people unconsciously because of my own conditioning. I don't exactly know what my question is, but it's around like the sorrow and grief of what we do, as well as the liberation of letting go. And I don't mean liberation with a big L necessarily, but just that relief of, oh, if I could just stop playing this game. So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Well, at Hokyoji, the first time I had been the previous year, I had been, there for the first time. And now we're having a whole new Ango. And the very, very beginning of it, an old friend sat me down under the bell tower for a little quiet discussion in which he essentially showed me what I had been doing wrong the year before. That he said that I hadn't understood that as a leader, I had a megaphone and that megaphone was kind of hard to hear. And I wept. What else is there to do at that point? I wept. I felt all I had felt so good about doing the year before was a big failure. And I had harmed people. And then I had to get up and go do it again. So it's painful. Just, when we study our privilege and our class issues like that, it is painful. But in doing that, for instance, in that, we are studying and dismantling, seeing how that whole operation of imposing ourselves runs throughout our lives, and that we can see it and see through it. Yes, it's painful to see ourselves behaving badly, having behaved badly, to embarrass ourselves. So we need good friends in the Dharma, good friends in our partners and spouses, and to forgive ourselves and each other. There's a lot of forgiving going on in this, which is in itself a softening. Because I think even once I had finished weeping under the bell tower, under the bell, I was starting to forgive myself for I'd done the best I could, and now I had another chance to do it differently, a little better. And so it is, I wouldn't say tedious, but painful, and sometimes minutely painful, and yet living the way we've been living is what's really painful. And as we see that. So then we can live with a little more freedom. Then the pain of discovering is not as great as we understand as the pain of living the way we've been living. But we need each other to sustain us through insight. So I would never have guessed, if not hearing that you are the son of a 3-star general. You do not act like a military general, in my experience of you. So you've come a long way, baby. Is there a last comment or before we go on? Otherwise, we'll go on to I'll wait just a moment.
On this idea, thank you for the talk, much to think over or reflect on. This idea of that small I and how we impose our story. I was observing the lizard on this little cement pad outside, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm the first person in the world who has seen a lizard doing yoga. And it was moving back and forth between a cobra and a downward facing dog. And I thought, oh my God, I'm gonna have to, I'll announce this to the world. I took a step forward in a while and the lizard scampered off, and I went over to look more closely. And of course, the lizard had been pooping. So it was about poop and not about yoga. But my view of the world, I was only looking at yoga right then and imposing it on all the on my natural environment.
But it must say that's a very mild-mannered imposition. It was an imposition of view.
I'm choosing to only give a mild-mannered one, but we all know there's.
Yes. Yeah.
Thought we could end on a poop note.
Right. But it's wonderful to have that image you have. That's wonderful. The first person who's ever seen this and have your bubble burst. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great place to end our comments right there. So let's go to our closing chants, the 4 great bodhisattva vows. They're in the chat.
Four great bodhisattva vows. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it.